Hi friends! So today we're gonna go over my favorite nail polish colors. So there's all of this. Like, not all of this is nail polish, but I'm gonna show you each when I pull out the polish. I'm gonna also show you this so you can see how it looks. Just keep in mind that this is clear, so it shows up slightly different on your actual nails. We're first gonna start out with my OPIs. The first one we have is a bloom with a view. Here is the swatch for this one. Next we have Leaf by Example. And here's the swatch for this one. Next we're gonna go in with my Beauty Pals. First we have this shade 2. I don't have a swatch for shade 2 because I just got it, but this one's very similar to the next one. These are the ones I use for my base for my French tips. Next we have the shade Y060. See, this one's almost out. And here is the swatch for this one. Next, we'll do my Melody Susie. It's in the shade Z039. It's kind of like a pinky mauve shimmer. And here's a swatch for this one. Next, we'll go on with my LA Girl. This is in the shade Flex. And here's the swatch for this one. Next, we'll go with my LA Colors. The first one I have is Zing. And here is the swatch for this one. Next, we have the shade Chill Out. And here's the swatch for this one. Next, we'll do my D&D colors. First, we have 2 from the Diva collection. This one is Sunday Brunch. This one's like a corally orange. And here is the swatch for that one. Next, we have Wanna Kiss. Then here's the swatch for that one. I will say this one, I had this on last summer and I had it at the beach. The sun changed it to white. There's knowledge for you. Next, we have my 2 D&D collection ones. First, we have the shade Voodoo. This is pretty green. And here is the swatch for this one. Next, we have She's White, She's Pink. I don't have a swatch for her because I just got her. Next, we have my 2 shades from the DC collection. The first one up is Cherry Rose. And here's the swatch for this one. Next, we have Pepperwood. And here's the swatch for this one. Now we're going to go in with my Models 1 collection. These are all jelly-like. First we have the shade 1634. It's just a sheer. Here is the swatch for that one. Next up we have the shade 2419. Here's the swatch for this one. Next up we have the shade 2375. And here's the swatch for this one. Next we have the shade 2377. Here is the swatch. Next we have the shade 2376. And here is the swatch for this one. Lastly, we have the shade 2378. This is like a purple gel. And here is the swatch for this one. Next we have all of my Jodso nail polishes. We're gonna go by number order. We have the shade B01. It's just black. It's just your typical black nail polish. And here's the swatch for this one. Number 2 is B02. Here it is. And here is the swatch for it. B03 is just your classic red. Here is the swatch. Here is shade B04. Here is the swatch for it. Here is B05. It's like a pinky. And here is that swatch. We have B06. Here is the swatch for that one. Here's the shade B07. Here's the swatch for that one. Here is B08, just a blue. Here is that swatch. And here's shade B09. Here is that swatch. Next up we have B10. Here is the swatch for that one. Here is B11. Here is a swatch for that one. Here is B12. Here is the swatch for this one. Here is shade B13. This is like a pine green. Here is shade B13. And here is shade B14. This is more mossy. Here is shade B14. Here is shade B15. Here is that swatch for B15. Here is shade B16. Here's the swatch. Here's B17. It's like a deep purple. And here is that swatch. Here is B18. This one's like another turquoise. Here is the swatch. Here is B19. Here is the swatch for this one. Here is B20. It's like more of a neon corally orange salamander. And here's a swatch for this one. Here is B21. Here is a swatch for that one. Here is B22. Here is the swatch for this one. Here is B23. Here is the swatch for that one. And we got B24 next. This is the swatch for that one. Here's B25. Here is that one. We have B26. Here's that one. Here is the swatch for this one. Here's B27. Here's the swatch for this one. Here we have B28. Here's the swatch for that one. Here is B29. Here's a swatch for that one. And here's B30. Here's this one. Here's a swatch for this one. Here's B31. It's a pale yellow. Here's the swatch for this one. Here is B32. It's a nice orange. There's the swatch for that one. Here is B33. Here's a swatch for this one. Here's B34. Here's the swatch for B34. Here is B35. Here is that swatch. Here is B36. Here's the swatch for this one. Here is B37. Here's this swatch. Here's B38. There's the swatch. Here is B39. Here's that swatch for 39. And here's B40. Kind of has some blue in it. Here is the swatch. Here is B41. Here's the swatch for this one. Next we have B42. And it's neon. Surprise! Here's the swatch for this one. Here is B43. Hot pink. Here is this swatch. And B44. Here is this swatch. Here is B45. Here is the swatch. Here is B46. Here is this swatch. We have B47. Here is the swatch for this one. Here is B48. Here is the swatch. Next we have B49. Here's this one. Here is B50. Here's this swatch. And now we have B51. Here's the swatch for that one if you put on a few coats of it. Here is B52, sheer white. Here is that swatch with a few coats on it. Here we have B53. Here's this one. Here is the swatch. I lied. We only have 55 in this set, so I have 75 colors. Here is B54. Here is this swatch. And finally, we have B55. Here is the shade. Now that I have showed you all of my nail polish colors, I'm going to show you my top favorites. To start off, these are my top colors on the swatches, and I'm going to go in and show you all of the bottles. I have 3 D&D top favorites. Sunday Brunch. It's the corally orange, and it is just beautiful. I'm obsessed. This is a must every single summer. Here is this shade again. Lastly, I'm obsessed. Perfect for professional pictures, grad pictures. It's in the shade She's White, She's Pink. I will always recommend this. Here's this shade again. I have one go-to for Model 1. It made it look like I almost had like blood on my nails. It was really cool. I'm usually not a red girl. I love this so much. It is in the shade 2377. Now I have my Jodstone. We have the shades B47 and B54. B47 again. Gorgeous. B54. My 2 blues. B50. I mean, are you kidding? B08. Thicker, not as light. My 2 purpley ones. B36. Here it is. I'm obsessed with this one. B15. So here's this one. I love this. And last but not least, B49. And that is all of my nail polish colors that I own. And I hope you guys got some inspo. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys later. Bye.